I'm David Leonhardt with the New York Times, and we're pleased here to have Jason Furman, who is, of course, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors currently. He's been many other things. He's run the Hamilton Project. He's worked in the White House. He's worked at NYU. He's been an advisor to many policymakers and campaigns over the years. And we obviously are going to talk about many of the same things that we've already been talking about here. And I think a good place to start is with the impending 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, right? It's a year for a lot of anniversaries. We've got obviously the 50th JFK anniversary, the 150th Gettysburg, and the next one that may start to get some attention is the 50th anniversary of the announcement of the War on Poverty, which was in LBJ's State of the Union in '64, is that right? Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a nice time to ask the question of what parts of the War on Poverty have worked and what parts haven't.
Great, thanks for that question, David, and thanks for organizing this event. If you look back at what's happened to poverty in the last several decades, you see something, I think, pretty remarkable. And when I say look back, you can't look in the official statistics, which are very flawed in ways a lot of people in this room understand. But you look at some independent estimates, and here I'll rely on a research group from Columbia. If you take out taxes and transfers, so you just look at market income, the poverty rate in 1967 and the poverty rate in 2011 was almost exactly the same. Based on market incomes, we made no progress on poverty.
What was it,
over
roughly?
that period of time. It's around 31%.
Okay.
If you then take into account taxes and transfers, and the official poverty measure only includes cash transfers. It doesn't include SNAP, which you've all just been talking about. It doesn't include things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, all of which have become increasingly important anti-poverty measures. But if you do include all of those, you then see that your poverty rate fell by 40% between 1967 and 2011. You made a lot of progress on poverty, and you made it precisely because of the policies that aren't captured in the official poverty measure. So what that says to me in terms of big picture is a lot of what we did in the War on Poverty was very successful. A lot of what we've done since then when it comes to expanding refundable tax credits has been very successful. But if you ask how we're going to make progress going forward, we should continue to try to improve on that policy dimension. But I think realistically, a lot of what you're going to be able to do is defend the gains you've made. Make sure you're not making large cuts to SNAP. Make sure you are extending the gains we made in the Earned Income Tax Credit. The progress we're going to need to make is on market incomes, on wages. And an important part of that, there's a lot of parts, but one part is the minimum wage. Part of why that poverty rate didn't fall is that the minimum wage fell in real terms by 23% between 1967 and 2011. So raising that minimum wage is one of the many things we can do to help market incomes and to continue to make progress on poverty.
It seems obvious in so many ways that the minimum wage is something that could counteract poverty and help low-income families. And yet it also seems to have real limitations. When you look at the decline in the minimum wage that you're talking about, it was mostly in the first part of that period, right? It was mostly from the late 60s to the late 80s that it fell. Yep. I think it may even be up in real terms since the late 80s. And yet, obviously, since the late 80s, low-income families have not done particularly well. How should we think about the fact that over a different time period, over the last quarter century, the minimum wage has risen in real terms, and yet low-income families have not done so well?
I mean, for 1 second, let me take you back even further, which is the minimum wage in 2013 is less in real terms than it was in 1950.
Okay.
And our productivity has increased 200% since then. Our economy per capita has expanded our wealth has expanded eightfold, and the minimum wage is lower than it was 63 years ago. So I think if you look at the big sweep of history, there's certainly room for a higher minimum wage. But no, it's only one of the factors, and it's not, for example, if you look at the big increase in inequality of the top 1% or the top 1/100th of 1%, the minimum wage is not an important part of that story. If you look at something like the differential in earnings between the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile, the minimum wage is a big part of that story. And a lot of the increase we've seen is at the very top of inequality.
I'm sure many of you know the research on the minimum wage. Paul Krugman covered some of it in a recent column. It seems pretty clear that the worries that a modest increase in the minimum wage will cause large job losses are unfounded, right? The famous Pennsylvania, New Jersey experiment, in part looked at by your predecessor, right? Alan Kruger when he was at Princeton, where he is again. But the minimum wage isn't a free lunch, right? I mean, it seems to me the right way to think about the minimum wage is that it is a transfer from consumers who skew higher income, of course, because the population as a whole does, to lower income workers. Is that the right way to think about it? It's not like the money that in an increased minimum wage comes from the sky, right? It's coming from people.
I think I mean, especially if you're looking at how the minimum wage would impact the economy over the next couple of years, I think you do want to think in terms of general equilibrium and what the broader set of ramifications. So the Chicago Fed did a study, and they said raising the minimum wage, I think they looked at the equivalent of raising it to $9 an hour, would raise the short-term growth rate by 0.3% because of the extra purchasing power, and we're in an economy that's still not operating at full capacity. So at a time like now, you actually can have a certain amount, something closer to a free lunch when the economy is not using its full capacity. Using more of that capacity can get you things that you wouldn't have otherwise had.
And is that mostly because lower income people would be more likely to spend the marginal dollar?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So going beyond the minimum wage, what else would you put at the sort of top of the list of the things that should happen policy-wise to help low-income families?
Right. So the minimum wage is something that the day you do it, you get the benefits. To go all the way to the other temporal extreme, early childhood education. That's not going to do anything about inequality next year or the year after. That's one of the most important things that we should be doing as a society that we haven't yet done in a broad way that applies to all, to deal not just with inequality but with mobility. And there's a lot of debates you can have about inequality. There's no one who doesn't believe in the proposition of equality of opportunity. And you're kidding yourself if you think we have equality of opportunity in this country. And preschool is, a necessary condition for that. It's not sufficient, but it's a really important necessary one.
Speaking of early childhood, several of us in the media have raised the possibility that in the current upcoming budget negotiations, given how much the deficit is falling, it is plausible to imagine Democrats trading changes to Medicare and Social Security, not for higher taxes on the wealthy, because the deficit isn't as much of a concern as it was, but for important investments, to use a word the president likes. Is that crazy? Is it crazy to imagine a deal that would combine something like savings from Medicare and Social Security that's then plowed into something like early childhood education? Wouldn't that be a good deal for Democrats?
I guess I can just tell you what we'd like, and others can guess as to what ways you could package things. And there's no reason we can't be doing all of that. We can't be making progress on our medium and long-term deficit by reforming entitlements, by reforming our tax code in a way that brings rates down, but also brings in more revenue by cutting back on some wasteful tax expenditures, and also making investments in things like infrastructure and early childhood education. So we should be doing all of those. For people who can't do all of those, they'll have conversations about different ways to package it.
And what package might actually be reasonable to do. Yeah. So another big priority, it seems, in addition to early childhood education, this is also long-term, although maybe not quite as long-term as early childhood education, is narrowing the gaps in terms of who graduates from college. It seems to now be a focus of the First Ladies. Can you talk a little bit about what things you think the administration can do there, both with legislation and the always important question, without legislation?
Right, and that. Thank you for phrasing it that way, because part of why we're so excited about that issue is that is an area where just using the bully pulpit you can make some progress, and then with legislation you can make even more. And it begins even before you go to college. There's amazing research, some of which has been published by the Hamilton Project, on very low-cost interventions that can affect where students go to college, find out about a place that's better for them. There are things like the gainful employment regulation that can help the for-profit sector have incentives to up its game and make sure that it's graduating people that really have the skills and the earnings they'll need to repay that debt. There is a combination of transparency and information, subsidies like Pell Grants and American Opportunity Tax Credit to both make college more affordable and help families to afford it, but also really focus on value. I mean, a lot of what you care about is not what the tuition is, what you get in exchange for that tuition, and are you raising your earnings because of that? And then finally, making sure families are completing college. So it's the whole cycle from selecting the school to affording it to completing it.
One of the classic tasks, in fact, in some ways it is the classic task of your current job, is to be an economic truth teller within an administration, right? And to advise a president on the economics, no matter what the politics are. What do you think of the statement that the concerns about student debt are exaggerated? And that while, as you just, I think, suggested, having kids leave college without a degree and a bunch of debt is a terrible thing. That's a big problem. The idea that a kid leaves college with $25,000 in debt and a degree, which I think is now the average for a graduate, there's nothing wrong with $25,000 in debt for a typical college graduate in our current economy.
I think the question is, I guess there's a few questions, David, when you look at the actual policies. It's what you're getting for that debt. Are you doing what you can to make sure there's value? To the degree you have in, for example, the for-profit sector, which we were talking about before, a school that charges a lot, doesn't give people a lot of skills, and you just observe an extremely high default rate for students coming out of that program. Maybe that's a program that needs to improve and needs to change. And then there's also just things like the stability and predictability of interest rates. We had the interest rate this year was set to double. Mm-hmm. The president put forward a proposal. It wasn't the favorite proposal of everyone in his party. He said we needed to pay for smoothing out the interest rates. It wasn't just a free lunch. We couldn't just give that money out. And we were going to pay for it by linking the rate more closely to treasuries. And that would prevent it from rising dramatically today. But as interest rates rise and interest rates across the economy rise, student loan interest rates are now going to be tied to that. So if you look at the type of policies they have, they're about driving value and bringing greater stability and predictability.
Yeah. Enough questions from me. Let's open it up to all of you right here. Thanks a lot. Second row right here.
Thank you. I'm Gerald Chandler. What do you think of the current definition of poverty, which in Europe is anybody who has less than half of the income, average income, and the consequence in Europe is that if everybody's income doubles, you still have the same percentage of people in poverty. Here, the definition isn't exactly the same, but year after year, we do increase the definition of what is poverty. So with the current definition of poverty and the way it's always adjusted, can we ever get to where we have nobody in poverty?
I think there are advantages and disadvantages of different measures of poverty, and it makes sense to look at more than one. If you're going to only look at one measure of poverty, what's called the supplemental poverty measure, which we started computing a couple of years ago, would be the one I'd look at. And that's coherent in that it includes the effects of all of our policies. It also subtracts a set of costs, like the costs associated with working, and it adjusts the poverty threshold based on region, based on whether you own a home or not. But if you only looked at one thing, I'd look at that. But you want to look at more than one thing. As I said before, you're interested in what's happening to market incomes, and you're interested in what's happening as a result of public policy. So that's already gotten you two measures. I think there's some ways in which an absolute poverty measure makes a lot of sense because you like to be able to set a goal of eliminating something or cutting it in half and not end up on a treadmill. But obviously the standard of poverty 50 years from now is not going to be the same as the standard of poverty 50 years ago. So there's something to a relative measure as well. And that SPM actually does have embedded in it relative concepts. Finally, you want to look at issues like inequality, and to some degree, that European measure of poverty really is one slice of a measure of inequality, and that matters because that tells you, in a sense, what your society is capable of producing in terms of its income and whether or not that's translating through to ordinary citizens. So it's not a one answer.
On the aisle here, ma'am. And you want to be on deck? Get a microphone right here.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm glad that economic advisor can be here, and President Obama now should listen to you very carefully because he promised change, but doesn't seem to change in the right direction. It's in vicious cycle. I want to point out several.
Can I just ask you to ask one quick question?
I want you to address the issues, or I want to make sure that address the issues of accountability of each agency. So far as I know, from local to federal, whether it's education or Department of Justice, there's no accuracy, there's no accountability. And so the money can divert to different directions to promote the wrong.
Thank you.
Okay.
So what I would ask is, President Obama talked a lot about making government work, right? I recall this phrase, the iPod government, right, back in 2008. You can talk about healthcare if you want, but this isn't just a healthcare question. Do you think the administration has done enough to make government accountable and make it work efficiently?
Let me give you one in the poverty area. There used to be something called the Advanced Earned Income Tax Credit. It was a nice concept because it lets you get your EITC in advance. It helped with some of the smoothing issues that I heard Diane talking about on the last panel. But it was rife with fraud, rife with complication. And in our first budget, we proposed getting rid of it under, can I blame Peter for that, under Peter's leadership. And it was something that was then passed into law. So we also, at the same time, did a lot of things to obviously strengthen the earned income tax credit, including reducing marriage penalties, an issue that I think you were talking about more this morning in a broader context, and expanding it for families with 3 or more children. I think that would be a good example of cutting back on an area where there was fraud and errors and expanding areas where it should have been expanded and needed to be.
I have a question related to, could you speak on the role of data and the expansion of the access to data, perhaps in addressing issues moving forward for our nation?
Do you mean access to data for the government or for citizens?
Actually, both. So from a standpoint of the government having access to raw data to be able to analyze and perhaps be informed to make programs in the best form, but also in relation to the public of having access to data to perhaps push government in the direction of various ways.
Yeah. I mean, economists, we rely on data, we live for data, and one of the painful things in the current budget environment is you look at some of the choices that are eventually going to have to be made between collecting different data sets, all of which are really valuable and inform public policy choices. The thing I'd add, though, is data isn't just going out and surveying people. It can also mean building evaluation into what you're doing in terms of public policy and building in some randomization or something else that lets you figure out the best way that you're doing your programs, not just collecting the data. Because all the data in the world, if you didn't design programs to evaluate them well, will let you try to infer and try to guess, but won't give you the same type of definitive answers you can do by thinking through evaluation on the front end.
Speaking of data, I know that obesity has been a big interest of this administration. And we're about to have this fascinating experiment in Mexico with what is really a substantial soda tax. I think it's going to be 10% or something like that. Doesn't it seem like that has the potential to be an experiment unlike anything we've seen before in terms of a really substantial fiscal policy aimed at obesity?
Sure. I mean, economists always love other countries doing things and learn a lot from them. So,
I mean, it's just because it seems to me one thing that the soda industry has done is fought each one of these, right? Whether it's in Philadelphia, whether it's in New York, and now we have a fairly large-scale one that could potentially lead to a substantial change in soda consumption, which I think public health experts consider is about number one on the list. What else? Sir.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Gerwin. I'm with the Center for American Progress. And I work on youth econ issues there. And one of the biggest things we're focusing on is unemployment and underemployment for youth. And I think half of college grads are overqualified for their jobs. And I think there's 70% more college grads earning the minimum wage than there were a decade ago. Is there anything the administration can do without Congress to alleviate a lot of those issues?
I think a lot of that is about, in the short run, strengthening the economy. And we've seen the participation rate fall. Most of that is a demographic trend as you see the baby boomers retiring. But some of that has been a reduction in the participation rate for young people. And so getting those people back into the labor force, back into jobs is something that we would expect to see and want to see as the economy strengthens. Some of it, you just said, people who have educations that overqualify them for their jobs. Part of that is better jobs. Part of that also, though, is better figuring out how to match our education to what our job needs are. And that's especially true for some of the things the president went and visited a technical high school in New York a few weeks ago to talk about modernizing high schools with our community colleges, making sure that they're feeding in and serving the local job market. I think skills mismatch is not an important part of the explanation as to why the unemployment rate is elevated today. That doesn't mean that reducing skills mismatch wouldn't be a good idea to improve our economy going forward.
There are these dueling set of statistics about college grads that are a little bit confusing how to sort through. On the one hand, you have all these statistics like this that suggest it hasn't exactly been a great 15 years for college graduates, right? It hasn't been a great 15 years for anybody. On the other hand, the gap between what college graduates make and what everyone else makes is at an all-time high, right? And you look at that and you say, do we need to worry about how college graduates are doing?
Yeah. And that's, we worry about how everyone's doing.
Yes, I'm sure you do.
But yes, if you had one big picture message, it's that the rate of return to college has been high for a very long time. It's risen. It is, on average, a very good deal. But you worry about both the short run where the economy is now and what you can do to strengthen it, and you worry about improving averages, and averages themselves contain variances around those averages and how you can get the bottom up.
To come back to where we started to finish, the thing that I sometimes worry about with all the attention to be institutionally self-critical that we in the media pay to the struggles of college graduates is I worry sometimes it sends the message to low-income kids, maybe you shouldn't go to college. And it seems like that would be about the worst message those kids could hear.
Certainly you should be sending the message that if college makes sense for you, it should be affordable to you. On average, it's a really great deal, and it both gives you a lower unemployment rate and higher wages and more job security. So absolutely, that's the message we should be sending.
Let's end here. We've mentioned the minimum wage. We've mentioned education. What else should be at the top of the list of policies that you think would do the most to help low-income families?
The last thing I'd just say is anything that helps our growth is just because the growth in wages has been lower than the growth in productivity doesn't mean if you raise productivity growth by another 0.5 percentage point per year, you wouldn't expect that you're probably raising all wage growth by 0.5 point per year. So whether that's business tax reform, investments in infrastructure, improvements in training, improving our budget situation, any of those policies that are about our growth agenda are an important thing for anyone who cares about our poverty and inequality agenda to worry about as well.
Yeah, I guess we've never had a time in modern history in which we had a very healthy growth rate and low-income families weren't doing well, right? Which is another way of saying it. Thank you very much.
Okay.